Hi, everybody. I'm Rupal Ismin, the other half of Josh. I'm the director of the Sydney Knowledge Hub at the University of Sydney, which is a research commercialization center at the University of Sydney. And part of what we do is help external folks like, potentially some of you guys or the companies that you help connect to the researchers and the facilities of the University of Sydney. So that's actually how Josh met Sam. Enough of my pitch for my initiative. But plenty of stars had to align for Josh and Sam to connect and commit to each other and launch this business. And so, how great would it be if we could kind of bottle up that kismet that was there. For the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be hearing from the two of the most prominent academics in the neuropsychiatric field, and from Sam, who up until recently was a prominent academic in this field. I think Sam did a good job of introducing Professor Mark Connor from Macquarie University. Mark was part of the independent expert panel that the TGA called upon on their to review the literature to potentially reclassify MDMA and psilocybin from a Schedule 9 prohibited drug to a Schedule 8 controlled substance. And as Josh mentioned, we're going to hear about that any day, a real nail-biting moment right now for these guys. And Professor Iain McGregor, who is the director of the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics out of the University of Sydney. Iain is leading the application for funding to run a clinical trial for psilocybin as a treatment to anorexia, which I believe you're running an application right now. I don't know if there's more to...
But we had a successful application, but don't tell.
Hey.
Yeah, okay. Wasn't sure if I was...
Insider info.
So I'm going to actually start with Mark, if that's okay. There's a lot of optimism, obviously, and enthusiasm around psychedelics right now. Did your view on psilocybin and MDMA change as you were reviewing all the clinical trials from around the world?
I guess I hadn't thought a lot about it before I really started looking into it to do this TGA review. And so it sort of went from a curiosity to something more like, there's something really interesting here. And at least in the studies that we reviewed, there certainly seems to be strong indications for effectiveness in the conditions that people use them in. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't really aware of the history of use in the 1960s and how widespread the use had been and how relatively trouble-free that had been, which informs a lot of the development now because we have experience with psilocybin and LSD as therapeutic agents, just not the kind of experience that regulators seem to want now to have drugs scheduled as medicines. Mm.
And were there any gaps in the research that you think will be sticking points in to allow the rescheduling?
Well, I think the main thing is that the research has been done in placebo randomised trials. There aren't many trials. They've all been done using similar kinds of psychotherapy adjunct to taking the drug. Mm-hmm. So the evidence is for very specific situations. The patient selection was, very careful. So I think it's not so much gaps in what we know, but there's a lot of room to expand it into sort of, when it's used more broadly, potentially, into different indications, different patient populations, and different forms of administering the drug in terms of the adjunct psychotherapy. So all of that, they're not so much gaps as unknowns as to how effective it's going to be in those different situations.
And were those indications kind of concentrated in certain areas? Like, is there kind of a space that we saw a lot of these trials run in?
So we reviewed psilocybin and MDMA. A lot of the trials were for post-traumatic stress disorder. There was a little bit on treatment-resistant depression and end-of-life anxiety, but mostly it was around post-traumatic stress disorder, which of course is a complicated... all of these situations are complicated mental health situations. So it's not simple to say that it was used for this or that or the other. Mm-hmm. And most of the people in the trials had complex life histories and lots of prior therapy, lots of different drugs that they'd taken previously, either as part of therapy or otherwise. So they're very complicated. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And last question on the clinical trials, but are most of these in situations where there is a patient in a room, laying down, with some kind of guided therapy?
For the most part, not all of the psilocybin studies were. Sometimes that was more just putting a patient in a relaxing situation and letting them take a journey in a supportive environment. For the post-traumatic stress disorder, those studies were very much psychotherapists engaged in what they thought was an appropriate way of trying to kind of match thinking about the patient's situation with the drug therapy. So yeah, they were quite similar, and most of them were guided.
Great. We'll go over to Iain. You're leading an application for the funding, you successfully received the funding for the clinical trial.
Don't tweet it, folks, or we won't get the money.
No social media, folks. I don't know if you can answer this right now, but what's the hardest part about running a clinical trial like this?
Look, I think it's actually got a lot easier because there's been this kind of wave of science, and I think when there's people like the Hopkins Group, Roland Griffiths, there's David Nutt in London. There's actually been some very brave individuals over the last 10 years or so who've built the foundations for an ecosystem, a kind of universal ecosystem now that has allowed these psychedelic trials to take shape. So, I mean, David Nutt, who's the leading figure in this field, applauds Australia. He says, I can't believe it. Your government has given $15 million for trials in psychedelic science. That's unprecedented. Who does that? We can't get Boris Johnson to do that. Forget about it, So this is tremendous what these guys are doing, because you've hit the wave at just the right time, and also in the right place as well. You want the right time and the right place. I think you've got both. Australia is going to be a world leader in this. Yeah. We have some amazing people. Marg Ross down in Melbourne, Paul Lichnitsky, incredible thinker in this field. We've got these guys here as well, more on the preclinical side. This is a tremendous place to be doing this kind of work. So yeah, you can focus on the difficulties, and we certainly saw that with medicinal cannabis. So when the Lambert Initiative started in 2015, we just groaned and moaned and complained and fought the TGA all the time, and had a terrific number of fights actually. And then that subsides, and you realise that you have quite a compliant bureaucracy. I mean, the TGA are inspired enough to commission this guy to do that review when the interim decision around psilocybin and MDMA was not at all favourable. So they, rather than saying, no, you can't do it, drugs are bad, they said, well, wait a minute, let's have another look at this, and we'll get these guys to have a look. And they downscheduled THC from 9 to 8. I see no reason why this decision that we're all refreshing our screens to learn about is not going to be favourable in the next few days.
That's interesting, because one of the questions that you guys were asked a lot as you were fundraising was, why here? Why in Australia? And there, you gave the answer, kind of like a lot of the R&D tax incentives and so forth, but it's also this research environment is really conducive for it. There hasn't been much progress on the treatment for mental illness in many decades now, actually, despite a much deeper understanding of the mind and how the brain works. Why do you think that is?
God, how about a difficult question?
I mean, part of it's the commercials, which you might want to actually start. I don't know if you know the answer to this, but start off with the commercials, or Sam, and then maybe.
Well, I think pharma got stuck in a lucrative rut for quite a while there. So we had the SSRIs, which were very lucrative, blockbuster drugs galore. They had that all sewn up.
Still are lucrative and overprescribed, probably.
Yeah, terribly overprescribed. 1 in 8, Australians currently on a SSRI or similar antidepressant, probably more since COVID. And then you had the antipsychotics, which are basically horrible drugs, and horribly overprescribed as well, but incredibly lucrative despite their side effects. And I think you have to say that psychiatry takes some of the blame for that as well. There was a kind of cozy partnership between psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry, and we know that because there was congressional investigations in the USA that exploded that. And then when all the scandal erupted, we then had Big Pharma retreating because they realized, you know what, the brain's really hard. And these drugs are not very good, and they've got us all into trouble. And they're all generics now anyway, and we're bereft of new ideas. So it's been a terrible time to be a psychiatrist. I give a lot of talks to psychiatrists. They're all glum. We've got no new toys to play with. we've got all these people that we'd love to be able to help, but we've got nothing to help them with.
Yeah.
And that is another reason that this is the right time for what you guys are doing, because we desperately need a paradigm shift. And to have a drug that you don't have to take every day, that you maybe just have to take twice, it's not a very good business model for you guys, you know. You just have, you know, the one psilocybin dose and then maybe a top-up 6 weeks later. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Sam. That was terrific. Here's your $25, and I'll see you in 30 years' time. Hopefully not. But, you know, so it's a paradigm change, and I think it's a very, very good one. And it goes hand in hand with a kind of different way of understanding psychiatric disorders, more as disorders of neuroplasticity. So be careful about just homing in on 5-HT2A. You should, and you're probably doing this anyway, because I know how smart you both are. But what you really want to be doing is looking at neurotrophic expression in your cell culture models. You want something that is going to enhance plasticity in the brain.
We were just talking about this only hours ago, in fact.
Yeah, that's right. So don't get stuck in 5-HT2A, because that's probably just a trigger for a neurotrophic cascade, and it's that cascade that you want to be looking at and unpacking.
There are a class of molecules, so this is something that I didn't appreciate fully when we kicked this off, but there's an emerging class of molecules called psychoplastogens. These are things that, when you look at the structure and look at their profile in the sort of screens we're doing, should be psychoactive, should be psychedelic, and you put them in a standard mouse model for psychedelic activity, and they're absolutely not psychedelic, but they still have antidepressant properties. And this seems to be exactly this, these neurotrophic factors and neural plasticity associated with those changes. So there is a very real possibility that maybe an outcome of all this research is that we get an actual, you know, daily dosed antidepressant, but with a completely new mechanism of action and far fewer of the side effects that SSRIs have. It's a pretty exciting prospect.
Got a little bit of an education of Psylo because Josh was working from home during lockdown, so I heard all of your investor pitches. But one of the things, and I was talking to someone about this today earlier, is, you know, to bring a new drug to market, is also at, I think the average cost is $1.2 billion. There was a lot of fails for treatment of mental illness, and so I think that's why it's also incredible that you're already at kind of the pre-patent phase right now, provisional patent phase right now in such a short time. And I think also goes to, just to talk my husband up a little bit, but it goes to this amazing duo of kind of this, scientist with a tech entrepreneur who kind of knows how to run this drug discovery in a really lean way. Sam, there are many clinical trials with psilocybin happening right now. Do you see this research informing the indicators you're designing for, and like on top of the current research are you? They're happening all the time right now.
I would admit that I am definitely not the most current on all of the clinical research, and that's why we have great advisors like Iain on board, because there's just so much of it going on. It's psilocybin as an adjunct to psychotherapy has been designated a breakthrough therapy for treatment-resistant depression and for major depressive disorder, so two very extreme refractory types of depression. And that's a recognition by the FDA that these are groundbreaking treatments potentially based on the outcomes you're looking at. As a result, I think that's driven a lot of the new explorations for other areas, so anorexia nervosa, eating disorders, anxiety disorders and other affective disorders, and opioid use disorder and alcoholism, tobacco addiction. People are looking at this sort of model, this adjunct to psychotherapy model, for treating a number of different conditions that seem to arise from essentially bad neural habits, basically learned behaviours that need to be rewired. Mm-hmm. We definitely follow all of it. I'm pretty excited by the psychoplastogens work as well. The idea that you can have a psychedelic of sorts that still has a potential antidepressant profile. And just following all of the major trials. You have MDMA, I don't think of it as a psychedelic, but in phase 3 trials for PTSD, that could be an approved medicine in a year or so. That's sort of the trajectory that it's on. If that happens, that changes everything for phase 3 psilocybin trials as well. And once you have an approved medicine, the number of indications that people start looking at will explode as well. So it does have, as Iain said, I think it has the potential to be quite transformative in an area that hasn't seen much innovation in decades.
Mm-hmm. Great. Do we have any questions from the audience?
What's the regulatory process? So you've reviewed all this kind of research. Obviously, the weigh up the positives. Are there any negatives? Like, is there any documented kind of like super bad, outcomes that have happened that might scare the regulators into approving it?
I would say no. I mean, in none of the studies that we looked at was there any evidence for any kind of toxicity that you would need to worry about. People were taking controlled doses in safe situations. They monitored physiological parameters usually, and there wasn't anything in those situations that would be a cause of concern. No spikes in blood pressure or heart rate or anything like that. We were asked to see whether there was, any safety indications, and there really wasn't in any of the studies that we looked at.
It's like only good, no bad.
Well, yeah, I mean,
There is one caveat, right? So
Yeah.
the top line results for Compass, I think Mark makes a good point about the difference between acute toxicity and other forms of harm. So like these substances, psilocybin, LSD actually is one of the safest substances acutely that we've ever discovered. You can't overdose on LSD as far as anyone knows relative to the amount you need to take to get an effect. But an interesting finding recently from Compass's phase 2 studies of psilocybin for depressive disorders is that they had a slightly higher rate than expected of suicides, which is interesting. But as people point out, you're also dealing with the people who've tried every other treatment who have some of the most serious and refractory forms of depression on the planet. So there are things to look out for sure. But we just need to be measured about the risks and benefits. And in my opinion, personally, like the benefits far outweigh the risks enormously.
Danny wants to say something.
Fluoxetine also increases the rate of suicides. Many of the antidepressants,
Yeah.
the 5-HT, will increase the rate of suicide
Yeah.
because people become more active. There's nothing new under the sun. We know this since many years. There's no safe compound altogether. But LSD has been on the market for about 10 years, 8 years. There was no effects whatsoever. The dose is used, minuscule. Actually, we still don't really understand except that the ligand binds to the receptor in a very tight manner. We're talking about 200 micrograms in a human who is these days 80 or 90 kilograms. There's not many compounds that work in such conditions. Toxicity, this is almost like French pharmacology, which is called homeopathy.
What's the average weight of a grain of sand? That's probably about 1 milligram, right? So you're talking about a quarter of that, like less than that. It's truly like infinitesimal amounts of drugs. It's a very, very potent substance.
So most of these compounds are extremely safe. Honestly, repeated applications. I mean, MDMA, I would not recommend to use hundreds of grams of MDMA because you're going to end up with real problems. But in our situation, most of these compounds will be applied a couple of 3 times, something like this, or maybe repeatedly after 6 months, which is nothing compared to what you see, what is being used, for instance, in cancer, where you have compounds that are extremely toxic, but you have no choice because that's the name of the disease. So, if I could make a point, I think one of the major challenges is we're talking here about psilocybin and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So one thing that's incredibly important is the quality of the psychotherapy. and that's something that you guys don't have control over and something that people in the field are giving an incredible amount of thought to. Because you'll find enthusiasts who are not psychotherapists put in situations where they're involved in the drug administration and can be very harmful. Yeah. In those days, cell-based therapies can only be applied by people who are extremely well trained. Exactly. Some of the anti-cancer drugs have to be applied in a very conservative environment. Otherwise, they will not be there. So we don't talk about having these compounds being just distributed by pharmacists or prescribed by the GP. Actually, 80% of the antipsychotics, antidepressants are being prescribed by GPs. The patients have never seen a psychiatrist in the first place. So there's a lot of stuff around the corner that could be changed and needs to be changed eventually.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. You can certainly continue this conversation over drinks. But thank you so much, Iain and Mark.
Thank you.